Hello, this is Tony Blazer for the Motocross Vault presented by Blinzall. If you're in the market for some high-quality racing oil for your two-stroke or four, make sure you go to blinzall.com and use our discount code VAULT20 to save 20% at checkout. Thank you for all the support. Hello and welcome back to the Motocross Vault. My name is Tony Blazer, and what this video is going to cover is a look back at Suzuki's 1997 RM250. Now, the RM in this era is a pretty controversial machine. 1996 had an all-new RM250 and actually 125 as well. I own both of them this year. I really like them quite a bit. Here in 97, they had some fairly minor updates, but really the machine gets, in my opinion, a pretty bad rap because of the struggles that Jeremy McGrath and LaRocque and some of the factory team guys had on the machine. I think for the average rider, it was actually a pretty damn good bike. There was one major problem here in 97 I'll go over in the review, but for the most part, the bike was actually very competitive. It did well in the magazine shootouts. In fact, in 96, the RM actually won Dirt Bike and Motocross Action Shootout. It was very well reviewed, but I guess conventional wisdom now, because of people like McGrath talking about how much they disliked it and how much controversy there was at the factory level. A lot of people think these bikes were total piles of crap, but I don't think that was the case. I think unless you were an AMA Pro, those conventional forks worked really well. I mean, that suspension on that 96 was maybe the best suspension of any bike I've had. It was really phenomenal, those forks at least, and they were just great. Now for Supercross, obviously, I don't think they were nearly stiff enough. I was not going to press them to that level. In fact, 99% of the riders out there weren't going to do that. But on a Supercross track, yeah, there was flex, and then they ended up putting like a brace on them to try and make them a little better. But I don't think that was ever going to, be stiff enough for the kind of elite rider that Jeremy McGrath was. But for the average person who's buying the RM and riding it on an outdoor motocross track, they worked really well. Unfortunately, eventually, the fact that Suzuki was kind of the only of the Japanese manufacturers to go down that road, I think Showa was not willing to put any more development money into this if they were going to not have everybody else on board, and plus the factory team pushing back on it. I think it kind of turned the tide. I think conventional forks could have worked out if they'd stuck with them, but it only lasted I think maybe 3 years. I think by 99 the RM250 went back to an inverted design. So it's kind of an interesting year for the motorcycles in general here in the 90s, where they were kind of experimenting with some different things. And again, this RM250 I think was a machine that a lot of people have a bad impression of, in spite of the fact that I don't think it was nearly as bad a machine for the average rider. Maybe not McGrath. I get, Jeremy McGrath, Mike LaRocque, they really want different things from a motorcycle than the average rider does. And maybe this RM wasn't the best at that, but for most people, I think it gets a bad rap. I think it was a better machine than most people probably think. If you like this sort of thing, make sure you check out some of the other videos I've done. I've done retrospectives on many other motocross, off-road, and ATV machines. You can find all those here on my channel. If you'd like to support what I do here at the Motocross Vault, I have Motocross Vault merch available through my Teespring store. I just came out with a new design that actually someone asked me to do for them. I had a request for one of Steve Lamson's DKNY Fast by Farachi Husqvarna designs, and I did that. It was a really unique machine. I was never a big fan of these Huskies in general. I thought they were kind of weird-looking motorcycles, but they're certainly an iconic design. And I remember seeing Lamson at, I believe it was the U.S. Opens the first time I saw him in the thing, and I just was like, holy crap, this is weird that he's on a Husqvarna. That was a strange deal back then, and it's certainly a very memorable era for moto. And if you'd like to check out this design and the many others I've done, covering all sorts of different machines from Kawasaki and Suzuki, Yamaha, all kinds of different stuff, including ATVs and what have you, you can find them on my Teespring store if you'd like to support what I do. So here, without further ado, is a look back at the 1997 Suzuki RM250. Today, the 1997 Suzuki RM250 is largely remembered as a disappointment by the moto masses. Mostly due to high-profile drama at the professional level, the 97 RM250's reputation has been permanently tainted by the perception of failure. In reality, however, the 97 RM was far from the roach of a machine many today would have you believe. It was a bike with many virtues and one fatal flaw that ended up taking the fall for a poorly planned season that ended up in disappointment. Fairly or unfairly, the 97 RM250 will forever be remembered as the machine that broke Jeremy McGrath's incredible streak of Supercross dominance. While that had very little to do with the machine's competence below the AMA professional level, this perceived failure will forever color the public's perception of the 97 RM. For Suzuki, the early 90s were a tough era in the 250 class. After garnering accolades in 1988 with a much improved RM250, the Yellow Team had taken a big gamble by introducing an all-new machine in 1989. The redesigned RM250 made several strides in appearance, ergonomics, and overall design, but met with rather mixed reviews in the magazines. Its all-new case-reed motor was long on punch but short on breadth, and its ultra-aggressive new chassis was great for supercross but sketchy at anything else. Riders loved the RM's looks, turning, and feathery feel, but were more lukewarm on its power characteristics and utter lack of stability. Abrupt, twitchy, and at times unpredictable, the RM250s of the early 90s were supercross-bred machines that put off as many riders as they pleased. By 1995, Suzuki was ready to finally scrap their aging 250 platform in favor of an all-new design. That season, they lured 5-time World Motocross champion Roger DeCoster out of retirement to help right their ship, and he was very keen to get their team an improved machine for 1996. Originally, this new platform was slated to make its debut in 1997, but DeCoster pushed the brass in Japan to move the timetable forward. While it would be a late-season release, Suzuki agreed to fast-track the new RM and get it to the race team and in the hands of consumers ahead of schedule. Unlike the 1993 refresh, this new machine was set to be a complete reimagining of the RM250 platform. At the time, many considered the Honda CR250R to be the gold standard in the 250 class, and the new Suzuki design was set to crib more than a few design cues from the highly successful Red machines. A new motor did away with the old RM's controversial case redesign and replaced it with a more conventional for a 250 direct cylinder induction. The chassis was all new as well, and aimed at taming much of the old machine's unruly behavior. On the suspension front, the new RM broke major ground by eschewing the conventional wisdom of the time and introducing an all-new 49mm conventional fork that aimed to combine the precision of the inverted designs with the compliance of the old-school conventional forks of the 80s. This new conventional design combated flex by increasing the diameter of the legs significantly and reduced the underhang below the axle to address the other major complaint riders had voiced about the older designs. Internally, the forks were less of a departure, retaining Showa's excellent twin-chamber cartridge design for their damping control. For Suzuki, the move to the new platform was a tremendous success. The new RM was very well reviewed by the press, taking home victories in both motocross action and dirt bikes 250 shootouts in '96. Riders absolutely loved the performance of the new Showa conventional forks, and they were praised for their incredible comfort and compliance. With sleek bodywork, great ergonomics, and a stout chassis, the new RM's handling was a tremendous improvement over 1995. The machine's handling was a dream on the track, with sharp turning, a feather-light feel, and surprisingly good stability. While the new chassis was the star of the show, the RM's revamped motor was far from a handicap for most average riders. The redesigned power plant mimicked the omnipotent CR250R's internal dimensions and delivered a reasonable facsimile of the Red machine's performance. Low-end torque and top-end power were much improved, with the RM delivering a wide and easy-to-use spread of power. It was still not as outright powerful as the brawny CR and torque monster Kawasaki KX, but it easily outpowered the anemic YZ in 1996. Where things went wrong for the RM was in the quality department. The rush to production led to many failures that probably could have been avoided with a little more time and testing. Kickstarters, transmissions, clutches, linkages, and wheels all proved fragile and prone to failures. Some of these issues were addressed by dealers, and some of them were left to the consumer to grin and bear. If you were slow and easy on your machine, you were likely to love the new RM. If, however, you are a pro-level hammerhead, you are most likely to rack up quite an extensive repair bill keeping the fragile Suzuki on the track. At the factory level, this fragility was less of an issue, but DeCoster's squad endured their own myriad of issues in 1996. While the move to the new conventional forks was lauded by magazine editors and consumers alike, it was less loved by AMA pros like Mike LaRocco and Greg Albertine, who found its built-in compliance a hindrance rather than a blessing. For elite riders like LaRocco and Albie, the new conventional forks displayed too much flex for proper control. For them, the new motor was also far too mellow, and its all-new design meant that Suzuki was behind its rivals in developing high-performance parts to extract the desired performance. Unfortunately, this internal discontent within the factory team made its way to several moto media outlets, and this only served to further tarnish the reputation of Suzuki's all-new machine. For 1997, Suzuki set out to address many of the 96 model's shortcomings with a slew of minor and modest updates. First up was a redesigned cylinder that aimed to boost power by redesigning the power valve system. In 1996, the RM's new motor featured a single-stage power valve that slid open using a pair of guillotine valves placed at the top of the exhaust port. While effective at giving the RM a solid hit in the mid-range, their on or off action made the transition into the mid-range rather abrupt. For 1997, Suzuki modified the automatic exhaust timing control system to allow the valves to open in stages. This was done by dividing the guillotine valves into two separate sections. At low RPM, the valve remained closed, but now as the RPMs rose, the valves opened gradually in two steps. In theory, this staging would provide a smoother transition as the power valve engaged. Mated to the revised power valve system was an all-new cylinder with revised porting to further broaden the power. An all-new ignition was added that Suzuki claimed would provide a more even burn by delivering a series of small sparks instead of a single large one. For 1997, the RM adopted the KX250's 38mm Kaheen PWK38 carburetor, which featured a small set of winglets in its venturi to reduce intake turbulence at low RPM settings. An all-new exhaust was also added that was reshaped to boost low to mid-range torque. To address the durability concerns of 1996, Suzuki beefed up several of the components in the RM's clutch and transmission for 97. The redesigned clutch featured a switch from aluminum to steel for the drive plates and a softer compound for the friction plates. This was done to increase longevity, reduce fluctuations in play at the lever, and deliver a more positive engagement. In the transmission, both second and fourth gear were increased in strength, and the final drive was lowered by adding an additional toot to the rear sprocket for 97. As in 96, the water pump continued to be housed inside the outer cases. This allowed Suzuki to use magnesium for their construction without the corrosion concerns that had plagued Honda in the mid-80s. This design also reduced the chances of damaging the water pump in a crash. Finally, the rigidity of the crankcase was increased by redesigning the mounting of the sprocket cover to no longer share the same bolt as the center cases. On the chassis front, most of the changes were aimed at the rear suspension in 97. In 1996, the majority of testers had liked the handling of the RM, but the shock was less loved. It was stiff in action and prone to kicking at times. For 97, Suzuki lengthened the swing arm by 10mm and redesigned the linkage to mimic the works linkages used on their factory machines in 1996. The new linkage was also stronger and designed to be more progressive in its action. The engineers also bolted on an all-new Showa shock that featured a 3mm increase in overall stroke for smoother action. Up front, the new conventional twin-chamber cartridge forks were back, with a few changes aimed at refining their performance and further mitigating any additional concerns. One of the significant concerns about the old-school conventional design had been the protrusion of the fork below the axle line. This caused the fork to catch in ruts and potentially affect cornering performance. One of the advantages of the new conventional design was a significant reduction in this protrusion. For 1997, Suzuki made this even less of a concern by reducing this overhang by an additional 20mm. Internally, the size of the cartridge in each fork was also increased to add plushness and provide smoother action. To further refine the handling of the RM and alleviate any wheel reliability concerns, the diameter of the front hub was increased and the spoke sets were changed from sets of 4 to sets of 6. This both strengthened the wheel and stiffened the front end to increase steering precision. Overall steering geometry was slightly changed for 97, with the new frame adding a half-degree less rake. In addition to the revised geometry, the 97 frame increased chassis strength by also enlarging the diameter of the main frame down tube by 3.2mm. Visually, the new RM looked nearly identical to the 96 model, with only a slight change in graphics and a shorter fork being the external cues. The bodywork, all new the year before, remained unchanged for 97, with more than a few people continuing to feel the RM looked like a yellow Honda. With the 97 CR250R moving to a radical new design, this was a less apt comparison, but there was no denying the RM remained a handsome machine. On the track, the 97 RM250 ran quite a bit differently than the 96 model that had captured several shootout victories. The new triple-stage power valve gave the power band a very stagey feel that many riders felt was a step back from 1996. Instead of providing the promised smoother flow of power, the new power valve system gave the power band a segmented feel as the valve slid open. Low-end power was noticeably softer than 96, with an even stronger mid-range hit as the valve engaged. Top-end power was improved slightly, but the RM did its best work through the middle. With the softer low-end and more abrupt mid-range, the RM did feel slightly faster. In many ways, this was a move back to the controversial RM250 power bands of the early 90s, and not everyone was on board with this change. Pros appreciated the hard hit and increased overrun, but less skilled pilots thought the broader power and smoother transition of the 96 motor was preferable. Regardless of how you came down on the power band issue, there was no denying that the RM lacked the firepower of the class-leading Honda and Kawasaki machines. Both the CR and KX outmuscled the Suzuki by a significant margin in 1997. At 41.5 peak horsepower, it gave up nearly 2 horsepower to the blazing fast CR and offered far less grunt than the ultra-torquey Kawasaki. In the lower classes, the RM made more than enough power for most riders, but pros were going to need some motor work to keep the CR and KX in sight. On the suspension front, the RM250 was a real tale of Jekyll and Hyde in 1997. The new conventional fork continued to garner rave reviews for their ultra-smooth performance. On an outdoor track, they were without peer, and riders fast and slow gushed about their incredible ability to soak up obstacles big and small. Overall damping performance was skewed toward faster riders, with firmer settings that offered excellent control on hard hits, while still providing decent comfort on small chop. On hard hits and slapdown landings, the conventional forks were noticeably less harsh than their inverted competition, and all three major magazines picked the 49mm Showas as the best forks in motocross. On a supercross track, ultra-fast pros like Mike Keeley noted the increased flex the front end exhibited, but this was only an issue for the 0.5% of riders capable of pushing the RM to its limits on such a demanding track. For the vast majority of riders likely to race an RM, the forks were near perfection. Out back, things were not nearly as successful. The addition of the new shock and works replica linkage took an already mediocre rear suspension system and made it much worse. Under acceleration, the rear of the RM bucked, chattered, and hopped as the shock struggled to keep the rear wheel in contact with the ground. There was way too much compression damping and a harsh spike in the mid-stroke that no amount of dial spinning seemed to alleviate. Out of slick and choppy turns, the RM was an absolute handful as the hard-hitting motor and hop-o-matic shock struggled to find traction. Over large whoops and big jumps, the shock worked well, but its performance on smaller obstacles was abysmal. Just as unanimously as the forks had been praised, the 97 RM shock was derided. Both novices and pros hated its performance and was rated by far the worst suspension in the 97 250 field. On the chassis front, the RM was an excellent handler once you got that shock sorted out. The ultra plush conventional forks, excellent ergonomics, and aggressive geometry allowed the RM's pilot to place the machine exactly where they wanted. Front end traction was excellent, and the RM was capable of cutting under most other machines in the class. With the stock shock in place, however, cornering and overall handling were much less predictable. Exiting turns at speed, the busy rear shock upset the chassis balance and made the bike far more of a handful than it should have been. While there was not a lot of head shake, the RM never quite felt planted until you did something to get that stock damper under control. With a revalve and some fine tuning, the RM was a great handling machine, but in stock condition, its poor shock handicapped an otherwise winning design. On the detailing front, the RM was an improvement for 97, but still a notch behind some of its competitors. The upgrades to the motor and chassis yielded improved reliability, but the RM remained a machine that felt worn out much faster than its red and blue rivals. Excessive play at the levers, butter-soft bars, and an ever-present rattling from the motor gave the bike a clapped-out feel that many riders did not appreciate. On the plus side, the transmission improvements yielded the slickest shifting cog box in the class, and blown gear sets were much less common than the year before. The clutch pull was also super light, but hardcore abusers were likely to need some sort of upgrade to the springs and/or plates to prevent them from fading in long motos. The brakes, ergonomics, and overall comfort of the machine were excellent, and nearly everyone commented on how fun the RM was to ride. Its slightly narrow power and wonky shock hindered its effectiveness for racing, but if you were looking for a bike to play around on, the RM was an excellent choice. Overall, the 97 RM250 was a machine with many positive traits and one fatal flaw. It offered Sano looks, slick ergonomics, a competitive motor, and the best forks in the sport. For the vast majority of riders not paid to ride the machine, the RM's next-generation conventional forks were a tremendous advantage. Unfortunately, its poorly set up shock was just as bad as the forks were good, and that torpedoed any chance the RM had of repeating its 96 shootout victories. In spite of the 2 decades of bad press that have been aimed at the machine, the 97 RM250 was not nearly as bad as the conventional wisdom today would have you believe. With a shock revalve, the RM was an excellent motocross mount and more than competitive in any class below the AMA Pro level. For the 2% of riders who were capable of pushing the RM to its limits, the motor, clutch, and conventional forks were a hindrance, but that only affected a tiny sliver of the buying public. For the majority of riders, the 97 RM250 was a fun, fast, and competitive machine capable of winning on any Sunday. So there you have it. That's a look back at the 1997 Suzuki RM250, a machine that, as I said in the review, I think it's kind of a bad rap. It wasn't nearly as bad of a machine as a lot of people seem to remember. The 96 was a really good bike with some reliability issues. This 97 improved a lot of that. The one area where they did go back, I guess maybe 2 areas. The motor was probably not as effective here in 97. As I said, I own the 96. I liked it quite a bit. I have ridden a 97. The motor is a little punchier and not as broad as the 97. I'm sorry, as the 96 was. The suspension, though, still, the forks were phenomenal. Here in 97, they did make a misstep as far as the shock goes. It wasn't as good as the 96 shock, and was really the one thing where the bike was really kind of lacking for the average rider. You know, it wasn't a powerhouse. The Honda certainly, I had a 96 CR250, and it was definitely faster than the 96 or 97 RM. That thing was just a powerhouse. And really nobody else had that kind of power that Honda was making at the time. Kawasaki was very torquey, had a different style of power. This RMs in this era, I think they were kind of trying to mimic what Honda was doing, and they weren't as effective at it, but the bike was still very competitive, and it wasn't nearly as bad as a lot of people, I think, would have you believe now. So in any case, if you like this sort of thing, make sure you check out some of the other videos I've done. I've done retrospectives on all sorts of other machines. You can find them here on my channel. And if you could share this out on social media, let your friends and family and coworkers and everybody else know about my channel, I'd really appreciate it. So until we meet again, this is Tony Blazer for the Motocross Vault. Keep the rubber side down. Peace.